You're listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Here are your hosts, Fran Chismar and Tom Knezik.
Welcome back to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast presented by Pinelands Nursery. I am Fran Chismar.
And I'm Tom Knezik. Welcome to episode 154. And we got a really interesting one today.
I'm excited about this one. It kind of was spawned from a comment on our Facebook group after the landmark. When we had Dr. Groffman on, he wanted to talk about the HOA case. What was it? They fought the lawn and they won.
And they fought the lawn and the lawn lost.
Yeah, and the lawn lost. That's it. So,
which was a couple in Maryland who basically took on their HOA and eventually got rules changed so they were allowed to grow a more wild native plant landscape in their yard. And but that's not everyone's experience.
That's just one experience. There's thousands of experiences out there, and I would imagine as the tides shift and people are becoming more ecologically focused, that this is going to be more of an issue. So, this is just the beginning. But many people have had long battles, and those have kind of been silent. So that's where we thought we could come in.
Yeah, so we had a listener that reached out on our Facebook, kind of giving their perspective, and we said this would be a great story to share on the podcast to kind of know that if you want to do this, if you live in an HOA community, it might not be as easy as some people make it out to be, and they want to share some of their experiences. So, Melinda, I'd like you to introduce yourself and kind of start how you got into native plants and what inspired you to start using them in your yard.
Thanks, Tom. So, my name is Melinda. I've always really been into kind of wildlife, and I think everybody, including myself, was really surprised that I didn't end up getting a degree and going to a career in the environment somehow. But when I started to try to learn how I could get more wildlife in my yard, and when I had kids, was pregnant and had kids, started to try to learn about what are the choices that I can make that it can be healthier for me, what can be healthier for the planet, and they all really come together. And so I learned that the best thing to do to get wildlife into your yard was to plant native plants. I can't say I didn't know anything about plants before that, nothing at all. And so the first resource I think I looked at was the National Wildlife Federation and getting your yard certified. And that's where I started. And in our old house, the yard was beautifully landscaped about 4 years before we bought it, and then it had gone through a couple owners, and they had an irrigation system installed, which was now defunct. And without that without that irrigation system, all of the plants started to die. They had these beautiful hydrangeas and all this stuff, and I was looking into it and realized that that was part of the reason. And there was no way I could put that amount of effort into my yard at that time. First I was working and then I had little kids. And so when I found out that not only are native plants good for the wildlife, but that in some ways they are less maintenance, I was really all in. So that's really how I got started.
It's amazing when you see those beautifully manicured non-native lawns. It's unbelievable if you haven't done the work, how much work it is to maintain that, because it is unnatural. It's the watering, the fertilizing, all that, or an irrigation system, all these things that are needed because you're trying to fix an unnatural ecosystem that you created. It's a lot of work. I don't know that I have that kind of commitment to doing that, but I guess maybe we should start just in what part of the country, what state do you live in, and how long have you been in the property that you're in now?
So I'm in Northern Virginia, which is not what most people think of when they think of Virginia. I think a lot of people think of Virginia as kind of this rolling hillside, and a lot of it is. But up here in Northern Virginia, we're in what we call the DMV, which is the DC metro, right? So DC, Maryland, Virginia. And it's a lot of suburbs. And this house, we've been here for just about 10 years now. And it was actually, when it was created, was one of the very first HOAs in the area. In fact, there's a Washington Post article from the 90s written about this HOA, which is kind of funny because it was one of the first ones. Yeah. And we knew it had an HOA when we bought it, and we read the rules, and they seemed pretty lax. We spoke to people that lived here, and everybody told me, yeah, no big deal. It's fine. And it actually is bordered by a really wonderful park system that was created to be a riparian buffer. There's a stream that kind of runs and really borders the whole neighborhood, and it's just bordered on three sides by nature, and then on a highway on the other side. And that the trails were great. We loved that. So, when we moved here, we had, like I said, come from another house nearby that had a lot of wildlife in the yard, and also had an HOA, which was basically didn't do anything. So
okay, so I when I lived in Delaware in the mid-90s, I was part of an HOA, and the HOA didn't really do anything. They just wanted to make sure your dogs weren't barking in the middle of the night, and that you paid your dues for snow plowing and things like that. Other than that, they really didn't care. And
I think that's really what started people on HOAs is like, let's all be good neighbors. But, one of the things that they wrote up in that article about this HOA is that one of the rules that's written in is that you can't have a clothesline.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that really, really rubs me the wrong way because, dryers use a lot of energy, right? And what's the best way to dry your clothes? So anyway.
Yeah. That's I think a little more common. I believe that was one of the original rules of Levittown, Pennsylvania, that there were no clotheslines because they didn't like that visual
in
there. So it's just amazing, and that was back at a time which I'm sure to even have a dryer was challenging.
Right.
So what was the ecological state of the property when you purchased it? What was your state of mind at that point when you were looking at it?
So, like I said, I had just started to educate myself. My kids were 1 and 3. So and I would say the people that lived in this house before us did what I did, which was basically what I call benign neglect, right? They didn't really do anything, but they weren't doing a lot of inputs into the yard either. So the backyard was completely wooded, I think, just from lack of care, which was fine. And so one of the first things that I learned was, what does poison ivy look like? And, and how do you get rid of that? And, so I really had started to learn about it, but I just didn't get it yet. Because when we looked at this property, one of the downsides in our mind was that there was no lawn in the back. How were our kids going to play? What were we going to do? And so we did consider cutting down the trees and ultimately did not. And now we have, this fairy tale of a backyard. It's completely shaded and the kids can play underneath and we find bugs and, we're looking for all worms and things like that. And so that was just kind of my starting point was like, how can I not make it worse? How can I not put chemicals on, what's going to happen? Mm-hmm. And so then after a while, I decided let's do a monarch way station. That was when the Monarch Watch program was really getting going. And that was just a couple years after we moved in. And again, my yard is completely shaded. Everything is shaded with the exception of that sidewalk strip, which a lot of people call the hell strip out front.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, cool. Well, a lot of people in my neighborhood have what I call mailbox gardens, right? Like little gardens out by their mailbox and then sometimes on the other side of the driveway. And I thought, well, that'd be a great place for a pollinator patch. And so, my cousin actually lives on the eastern shore of Maryland and does wild playgrounds. It's called Wild Child. She creates, basically like my backyard, but on purpose for school kids.
Nice. Very cool. That's a great concept.
Yeah. And so she told me, hey, listen, pick a color scheme, something simple, 1 or 2 colors, pick a small spot and just get started. And that's what I did. So I did sheet mulching in about 4x4 bed on either side of my driveway, bought a bunch of plants from my, local garden center and plugged them in. And the very first year on my Asclepias tuberosa, I had monarchs, and it was just absolutely amazing. And because, they tell you that tuberosa is not really their favorite. So to have it there, was just that I was off and running, right? And so then when a few years later the water company came and had to dig up a fifth of our front yard, I thought, this is serendipity. Let me just go ahead and replant this with natives instead of doing turf grass. And so I expanded that sidewalk strip bed. I want to say I had done little strips like the cues to care that they talk about, right? Like the mowed strips in between. But I think all told, I had, I want to say 25 feet out in front. Okay. And then I did a shade bed underneath my maple tree. And then I had I guess just kind of flown under the radar up until that point.
Well, so I was going to ask, like with the backyard being wooded, that posed no issues. No one had a problem with that because it was in the back. No. Like, did your neighbors like?
The three neighbors kind of behind us, we all have the same situation. The guy behind me, I say, he also goes by benign neglect, but for a different reason. And then actually my next door neighbor on the other side, when we first moved in, she was very supportive. She already had an NWF sign in her front yard for the Garden for Wildlife. She was very anti-HOA, had some run-ins herself, had not done well with the neighbors that lived in the house before us. And both she and the gentleman behind me told me multiple times, no one bothers to fill out those forms to make the landscape changes. It's pretty uncomfortable. You have to go, every time you make a change, you have to go around to every homeowner that might be affected by your decision and just let them know that you're putting in an application. And so if you're like me and you're constantly putting in a new flower bed or changing your stuff, I'm knocking on their door at least once a year and getting them to sign stuff. And so after the first few times of doing that, my neighbors were like, listen, nobody does this. I don't know why you're bothering. So I stopped. And but then my neighbors on the other side, she worked for the Piedmont Environmental Council. So really, was really felt very welcoming. Nobody, nearby said anything to me. I think everybody was happy to see that I was out. They were out working on your yard, right? You want to see people making progress, making changes. So really from the beginning, I felt really comfortable. I felt no problems.
So where does it go wrong? Where?
I was going to phrase that a little different and say, and then what happened next?
Because apparently
it's COVID's fault.
Yeah.
Is it? I was going to ask, like, what was the straw that broke the camel's back? Yeah. Like, there had to have been something where someone's like, all right, enough's enough.
Can I just cut in first and ask? Sure. And did you get any positive feedback with those initial things you did?
Yeah. So I had put out a Monarch Way Station sign, and I had put out a Xerces Society sign, and I even got little signs that say, moss phlox and a butterfly weed or whatever. And we got a lot of people stopping, especially after the signage went up, saying, "Oh, I didn't know what you were doing out here, but now I get it." Right. Mm-hmm. Which is what they tell you to do.
Yeah, signage is an important part, just so it makes people part of the conversation without you having to knock on their door.
Yep.
And my husband, it happened more often to my husband than to me, which I don't really understand. But people would stop him and say, "Hey, we love what you're doing out here." And he was always like, "Oh, it's my wife. I didn't have anything to do with it." He wanted to make sure I had all the credit for it. So yeah, a lot of positive feedback.
He knew what was going to go down.
Yeah. All right, now we can get
blame.
Now we can get in the negative stuff.
No, and it's not negative. It's just a narrative. But it is nice that you were getting positive, and I'm sure if you're getting all that positive feedback, it's encouraging to do more.
Absolutely.
It's like, oh, people are noticing this is really doing good. You're seeing fantastic results, and you want to. I mean, that's part of it. Like. You get the bug and you want to keep going. Like you see how much more good can I do?
Yeah.
And, exactly. When we talk to Benjamin Vogt, like he always shows pictures of the meadow on his property. And we've asked like, how many minds have you changed in your development? He's like, oh, none. They're all angry still. Like, so it's just nice that you started with positive feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have had people that, I'm skipping ahead in the story here, but when I had to take out a lot of my plants, I posted it. We have a lot of great local Facebook groups, and so I posted. And I had people crawling over themselves to come get these plants, and take them. And I made a lot of friends, and there's a lot of people in my neighborhood. I don't know how big usual HOAs are, but ours is about 1,400 houses, so there's a lot of people.
That's pretty big. Wow. I was going to ask that. I wasn't sure how many. 1,400 is pretty large.
Yeah.
So it's I was trying to think of what's the one plant community that's more ecologically. Is it Ruston in Ruston, Virginia?
So that's actually a good point. In my in Northern Virginia, we've got quite a few. John McGee, who we've had on the show before, right? So he's worked a lot in Ashburn. There's multiple neighborhoods in Ashburn that work with the Loudon Wildlife Conservancy, and he's managed some of those. Reston since the 70s, I think, was. Wow. But I'll tell you that someone reached out to me who lives in Ruston and said, "Listen, I'm having a problem with my HOA. What should I do?" Right? So, yeah.
So what was the first inclination that something was happening?
So I've definitely made some mistakes. I want to own my my missteps on this. There was a bone set that volunteered in that front strip, and I didn't know what it was. And there's 5 different kinds of bone sets. This one turned out to be like a 9-foot tall bone set that fell over into the street. And I left it because the bees were just all over it. And I was like, as soon as it's done flowering, I'm going to take it out. And at the same time, this was 2020, the kids were home, and the black-eyed Susans, did their thing and were just everywhere. And then, it didn't rain for a while. And so we had these kind of brown, stocky looking things. It didn't look great. But I really bought into the idea that let's see how your garden moves around. How does it shape itself? What does it want to be? And again, as I hadn't had any pushback, I hadn't had any negative comments from anyone. Those had all been kept to themselves. I was just kind of letting it do its thing and seeing what was going to happen. But that was the straw. It was that bone set, I guess. And so that's when I got the first letter. And I told them, I wrote back and I said, listen, I'm really sorry. I recognize. I explained what I was doing. I said, this is why I left it. I've taken it out. I've cleaned up the black-eyed Susans. And, I will make sure that I keep this under control. But, the blanket policy that they have in place here is that any change that you make has to be approved. And this hadn't been approved. So they said you have to put in an application. So I did eventually put in an application for it, and I explained everything, the Monarch Way Station, the Doug Tallamy, I had this whole long thing. And in retrospect, now that I am actually part of that board, I can see they probably didn't read it at all. It was too much information. It was way too much. And I had tried to explain what my grand plan was for it, and it was all the wrong approach. But there was really no way for me to know that going into that. And so again, I explained everything, and I was just absolutely sure that as soon as I told them what I was doing and why, that they'd be like, "Oh, of course, we get it." And I figured they wouldn't want it to be exactly the way it was, but that we would have a conversation and we'd figure it out. How can I do this, together with you? Got a flat no. Absolutely nothing. The entire thing had to come out and be grass, which I was just shocked because, like I said, plenty of other people in my neighborhood have those mailbox driveway gardens. In my neighborhood, only one side of the street has sidewalks. So that does change it a little bit because, you could argue, well, if you don't have a sidewalk, but again, lots of people had them. So just absolutely shocked. So I went and appealed to the big board, the overseeing board. And ironically, coincidentally, unhappily, I'm not really sure, right at the same time, I had posted in our neighborhood Facebook group, we have a Plant Virginia Natives campaign in our state, and there's little sections. So Plant Nova for Northern Virginia natives is very active, and they're doing a really, really great job. And they had a tree rescue campaign. And so I had just been sharing their information. And so one of the board members reached out to me and said, "Hey, will you come and give a presentation on trees?" Because they had been having a lot of problems with losing trees to the ash borer and all kinds of stuff. And he really wanted someone to come and talk to them about it. And I was like, well, what exactly are you looking for? Are you talking just native, just the trees, native plants? And he said, whatever you want, come in, talk about it. So it just accidentally happened to be the same night that I had to go in and do my appeal. And so I went in and I did this 15-minute presentation, and it went for 45 minutes because I had so many questions from the board, and it felt really welcoming. They were interested, with a couple exceptions, really, really kind of enthusiastic and supportive. And so that happened. And then I had my appeal, which I tried very hard to delineate the two in the meeting so they wouldn't get confused. And I felt really confident. They asked me no questions about my garden, and I was like, great, this means that they're on board. I get a letter 3 weeks later, flat no, 100%, don't do it. And take it out right now in January. And I had it was one of those weird ice storms. We almost never get snow down here, but we had one of those weird ice storms. So we had like a foot of ice and snow sitting on those beds. And I wrote back and I said, I can't put grass seed in right now. There's ice. It's January. And I said, and I will be putting in another application. I'm going to make some changes. I'm really looking forward to working with you, compromising. Let's see what we can figure out.
Can I ask one question? Were you doing the no cut back at that point? Did you have the perennial stems up? Okay.
Yeah.
And I was going to wonder. I
did explain it.
All right. I was wondering if they saw that and they're like, oh, we don't want that.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the problem, right? Is that I had said in there, 100 times, I'm willing to compromise. Let's talk. This is why I'm leaving the stalks. I'm open to a conversation. They didn't want to have a conversation with me. This is the biggest sticking point for me, is that no one said, Melinda, let's sit down and talk about this and figure it out. How can we work together? It was really just a absolute dictatorship kind of a thing, which they tell you it's not. I mean, that's one of the things that that I found so frustrating. And so I had left the stalks, and they said, you have to take that out. So I did. I cut down all of the stalks at that time in January, as soon as the ice was gone. And I put in another application. I said, listen, I've taken out the black-eyed Susans. I've taken out all these things. Those are the ones that looked unruly. I'd really like to, plant something. I suggested maybe it needs to be under 2 feet. Let's, what could we work out? And the ARB again, so that's the Architectural Review Board, the first board, they said again, well, I went on, I did a whole big appeal. I did a 10-minute speech, Doug Tallamy, blah, blah, blah. And they said, we'll see what we can do. So they said, you can have 2 feet around your mailbox. And I thought, again, well, that's great. And if I was completely bucking the trend, I'd consider that a win. But like hundreds of homes in my neighborhood had way more than that. Bushes growing over their I mean, just crazy stuff. So went back to the board and I said, listen, here's 200 pictures. It took me days. I would drove around my entire day, but 200 pictures of other people doing this same thing that I'm doing. Theirs just isn't a pollinator garden. It's something else. Yeah. And they were, very receptive. I had spoken to some of the board members ahead of time off the record, and they said, listen, you can have 4 feet on either side. And that seemed very reasonable to me. And I said, listen, what am I going to do about the other section? I really don't want to plant grass there. I think we can find another compromise. And they said, well, now that you're trying to join the ARB, right, which is the architectural board, you can have a conversation with them. I was like, great, this is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted. I considered this a total win. And I was like, no, I had already been talking about this Virginia legislation stuff. This was around the time the Maryland case came out. And I'm going to move on with my life. Well, lo and behold, the letter that I get from management later, which was supposed to echo what was said in the meeting, was not the tone at all. Take out that one section completely, do not pass go, do not collect $200, and you can have that section, the original section that we talked about. But it wasn't a pleasant letter.
It was wow. And, and you were saying at this point you were trying to join the board, and I know we're guilty of this, and we've heard a lot of other people say, oh, if you're having an issue, just get on the board. You'll have a voice. It will make a change. It will be different. Yeah. But that doesn't mean you could be like almost an intruder to them.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Someone
coming in trying to take over, and then all of a sudden the walls go up, I would imagine, and it's a whole different scenario.
And they have to kind of close, at least in my board, they have to close ranks. Like, I've been to the meetings and I've sat through the meetings, and, the letter that you get says the board voted unanimously to do XYZ. Well, that's not really what happened. I sat there and I watched it. And that's not really how it went down, right? So they do really close ranks. They won't say anything against anybody else. And I mean, I understand that. There's some legal issues at play, and I can't tell you how much I've learned over the past year. I'm on my PTA board now, which is another, functioning board. And I can see why we have to do things the way that we do them. But in the midst of this, I had run for the HOA elections, and I got a lot of support. I campaigned really hard on Facebook. I couldn't figure out how to campaign in person without kind of being, I don't want to knock on people's doors and be like, hey, vote for me, right? That nobody's going to want to vote for you if you do that.
Especially after COVID.
Yeah. So I got about 2/3 of the vote that I needed, which was really encouraging to me, because that means that, I wasn't an outlier. I wasn't, this isn't crazy. I just didn't quite get enough people to support me. there's a lot of angst in my neighborhood about different things. We can't, people are on different pages about, and we've got a lot of outgoing folks that are older and have different opinions about what's neat and tidy and what things should look like, right? So anyway, because I didn't get on the board, I joined the ARB, but that's a whole process too. And so in the process of doing that, you have to attend 3 meetings and then they kind of vote to let you in. And but you have to be a member in good standing. Okay. And so I got a letter saying you have to do this, and I said, listen, I'm going to the ARB to talk about it, just as we discussed in the meeting. And their understanding was different from mine, which was that I had to completely rip everything out and put in grass. And so I tried to argue against that for a while, but I really wanted to be part of the solution. I wanted people to see me as an agent of good change, not a crazy person. And so I said, fine. I took it out. I mean, I was in tears the whole time. As I'm taking it out, this guy walks by and he's like, what are you doing? And I explained, and he's like, oh, well, we have to do that for pricing in our neighborhood. I mean, that didn't hit great for me at the time. But anyway, like I said, I posted it all. I got a lot of people coming. I had to take out a state imperiled plant, a milkweed that I had put out there. And I really thought about using that because technically I wasn't allowed to remove that, right? Like that's technically against the law to remove, right? So, but there's a whole lot that goes into that. And so I said, you know what, let's just, I'm going to play nice. I'm going to get on the board. And so I did that. I took everything out. I put grass back in, and I go to the next meeting where I'm supposed to be allowed on. And there's a couple people that have been my biggest naysayers, and one of them is on the management. And she kind of had been lying in wait for me, and never doesn't usually come to these meetings, and really was like, no, you haven't, you're in violation still. You can't be on the board. You have to wait 6 months. And this was a complete shock to me, because all along they're like, you don't like it, you better volunteer and change it. And so that was my plan. I want to be able to, we have a 70% turf grass rule. Like, you have to have 70% turf grass in your front yard. And I'm like, that's not ecologically sound. I think we can do better. And some other things that I think need to be changed. And then they were telling me I couldn't be there. And so, but luckily there was a couple people on the board who were like, wait, I don't understand what's happening, because they were there for the same reason. They joined the board for the same reason. They were frustrated. They wanted to make changes. And then, so then to see somebody coming in. So I did eventually get on, because I wasn't technically in violation of anything, but to be told that's what you have to do, and then be told, no, sorry, we don't want you, really just kind of, that along with the letters that said, hey, you can't have kids' toys in your front yard. During COVID, I had one of the letters I got was, you can't have toys out in the front yard. You can't have a pool in your front yard. No one's else getting these letters. They were mad at me. It was obvious. So
for the people that represented the board, demographically, older, younger, like, had they been on the board for a very long time? Okay, so it's So no, it's interesting, because the management, so right, we have a paid management and we have a board, and the paid management is older. They've been there for as long as I've lived here. And then one of the about 50% of the board, I would say, are probably in their 60s. I don't really know anybody's age, and have been there here in the neighborhood for a long time, and have been on the board for a long time. The other 50%, they are probably late 40s. In the 50s, and have not been on the board for that long. Okay. And those are the folks that stood up for me. Those are the folks that said, yes, here's your 4 feet. Here's your 4 feet. I had a very, very contentious conversations with some of the older folks where, I don't know why. I'm usually a really nice person, but things went south. So yeah, it happens, to the best of us. And it's, the one thing that we're noticing, especially from our business standpoint, like, times are changing. Things are getting more tech savvy. People are becoming more aware of things that we can do better, or we know better now, so we need to make better choices. It's not the 70s when you're growing up with lead pencils and
right.
Asbestos ceilings in the schools, and smoking and mercury fillings, in your mouth. But we see it with some of our older clientele when you say, we have a website where you can place an order. They're not happy. That's not the change they want to see. and the hairs go up. So it's I can imagine like this is a change that they don't want, and they're grasping on. Yeah. But times are changing, and as it changes, it's going to change eventually. You would think.
I totally agree. I mean, most of the people that I talk to are for it. Most people are like, thank you for doing that. You know, they kind of feel like if I'm doing it, they don't have to do so much, which I don't love. But at least it's positive. But like these people they don't want to do Zoom meetings. They don't want to do online meetings. They want people to have to come into the building. And I know that it's harder. It's a pain. I have trouble with that too. But they don't want to change. They don't want solar panels on the front of your houses. They don't want to update these. They don't want electric cars sitting in the driveways charging, right? Like they don't. And I get that. And I made a lot of, I call them missteps. I don't want to call them mistakes because I had no idea what I was getting into. If I could go back now and go through this exact same process with the exact same people, I would do a lot of things differently because I would know how to approach these particular people.
That's one of the questions we're going to save till the end. We'll get through the whole thing.
Okay.
The one question I had before you continue, was there anyone before you that had done this that they were like, oh no, not this again? And maybe they were a little harder on you? Okay. I just didn't know if there was something that maybe happened that they're like, all right, this has happened before, we have to.
I do know of one instance where someone who moved from one end of the neighborhood to the other end of the neighborhood. So one thing about HOAs is where they can really get you is when you go to sell your house. And so if you have done something that's not allowed and you go to sell, you're not allowed to sell. They can put a lien on your property until you either fix that thing or get it approved or whatever, right? So somebody that I know that came to me when I was going through all this, she had just moved from one end of the neighborhood to the other. And I'm surprised she stayed in the neighborhood, honestly, after this, but she had done a bunch of native plantings in her front yard, ferns and things like that. And they wouldn't let her keep it. She hadn't gotten it approved. And again, the culture here is not, you have to get it approved, like the general culture, right? Like, so it seems to be targeted at people who are doing non-traditional things, right? I know plenty of people that have gone and sold and have not had a problem. And again, this is just my experience. So who knows if I'm seeing this correctly, but she had to rip everything out. She had to rip all of her ferns, everything out from her front yard in order to be able to sell, and move to another house, which ironically had a whole bunch of stuff done to the front of it that wasn't approved that they then had to correct. So
it's amazing some of the politics going in, even though this is an HOA, but we see it with our town politics all the time. With it seems if you sit in some of the township committee meetings and you maybe oppose, even constructively oppose some of the stuff that's going on, all of a sudden, like building inspectors show up and all these different inspectors start showing up, and you better have your permits in. It's it is interesting how you can get targeted like that by people who have like a little bit of power. And another thing you said about the rare milkweed reminded me of a New Jersey Native Plant Society meeting I went to years ago, and I can't remember the woman's name who said this. Someone gave a speech, or a talk, and it was all about like how to get your neighbors like to accept what you're doing in your yard, kind of. And but this one woman who an older woman originally from Canada, moved down to New Jersey, and then has since moved back to Canada. But she was like, oh, the easiest way to make sure that they can't tell you to take out all your native plantings is if you put in like a snag, and you'll attract these like rare tree frogs, and now they can't get rid of it because the tree frogs are there and you can't disrupt their habitat. But she laid out like this elaborate plan of how you're going to attract all these rare species.
Oh yeah,
and all of a sudden, and now it's illegal. You can't get rid of it. But so it reminded me of that. So.
All right, so where do you go from there? Where are you at now? And how far back are we at this point? We're about 2 to 3 years back.
So no, that's that was, I think that brought us up to the beginning of this. I think I kind of lost track of my story. Last year I ran for the board, didn't make it. Did join the ARB, but it took me until this January to actually get onto the ARB board.
Okay.
So that brings us up to, and so in the meanwhile, I had taken out that section. I had replanted it with grass. And the kicker for me, I'll tell you. So here's the thing. The thing is, like I said, I felt like I had won. I felt like we were good to go. Yeah. And then I kept getting these letters. You have to take out this also. This part's not okay. This is not okay. You can't have toys in your front yard. You can't do this. This is, you have to take out your Monarch Way Station signs. You can't have any signs. And that's really, and then I said, I don't understand why you would not want to encourage pollinators in the current, situation that we're in. And she wrote back to me, I can't imagine that any neighborhood would encourage wildlife in their yard. That's crazy. I shouldn't say that's crazy, but that was the gist of it. And so that's what pushed me over the edge and said, okay, I have to do something, because if she's going to do it to me, she's doing it to other people and I don't know about it. And if I can't even have something as benign as a sign saying, which is what you're supposed to do, right? It's one of the cues there from Doug Tallamy and Benjamin Vogt and all those guys, right? The whole point is to let people know what you're doing. If I, and by the way, I am allowed technically to have one sign, and it will be going back up at some point. But the fact that they were going to just double down on that was like, okay, I can't let this slide. I have to do something to change this. This is not an environment. And knowing that there were other neighborhoods out there that are doing this, and they fluctuate. I know one of the neighborhoods that John McGee worked on has kind of swung back around. The board has become a little less friendly, but it's a process. The tides are turning, and I just couldn't understand, if you're going to let me have this wildish looking front yard, why would you not want to have a sign out saying, hey, this is why we've let this come to be?
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all, to me at least. Did it get to the point where the things that they were sending you letters about, were they valid, or was it getting to the point where you were wondering if you were being harassed?
But yeah, absolutely. Okay. Felt like I was, because like I said, we have wonderful neighbors. So we have different neighbors now than we did when we first moved in. We've got kids on both sides of me. We've got a whole bunch of kids. When I moved in, we were the youngest family on the block, right? No one else had little kids. But across the street, lots of kids everywhere. No, I asked them all, repeat every time I got a letter. Did you guys get a letter about the gold sitting in your front yard? Did you get a letter about all this stuff? And the answer was no, never. No one else was getting letters about that. And there was emails being circulated about me to the board saying, oh, look at this, look at the leaves, look at the state of this, look at that. She hasn't done this. She hasn't done that. I wasn't getting letters about them, but they were saying this is why she can't be part of the board. This is why she can't be part of the process, because she's not keeping up her end of the bargain. And meanwhile, I've explained all along, these leaves are here. This is why they're here. Please talk to me. Let's have a conversation about this. There was never any conversation.
Well, if you don't want to bend, you don't have the conversation. Yeah.
Yes. And that's exactly the trick that they would play on me, is that they would sit there and look incredibly sympathetic and say, yes, okay, we hear you. Absolutely. We're going to talk about this and then we'll get back to you. Right. Well, they don't, the letter that came back to me was written by different people than the people who made the decision, and the tone in the letters. I mean, it's just, there's a lot. Some of it's going to be particular to my HOA and the way that my HOA is run, but some of it I'm sure is happening to people everywhere.
So I'm sorry, Tom.
I was going to say, you mentioned there were some folks that were on the HOA board that kind of had your back in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Did that support seem to wane as time went on? Did they feel frustrated or
I don't know.
How did things change?
I don't know. No one. They won't break ranks. They won't. Mm-hmm. They won't tell me what happened. One of those people's no longer on the board. Mm-hmm. I'm not entirely sure what happened, because in the end they sent me a letter from a lawyer, because I was really trying to say, I really don't want to take those plants out. I want to find a way to work with you. And so finally I got a letter from a lawyer. And the thing with HOAs is, once you get a letter from a lawyer, the conversation's over. There's nothing. Yeah. They won't talk to you at all. And so because I knew how much it had cost the Crouches $60,000 to fight their HOA. Yep. And I know there's a gentleman in Ashburn who spent $90,000 fighting his HOA. When he moved in, there was a meadow on his property, 5 acres, and they wanted him to take it out. He spent $90,000 fighting them, and he did win, but it was really more of an abeyance, right? Like it wasn't like in perpetuity, like you can keep this. And I was like, I'm not going to spend my family's money on this.
Well, that's what I was going to say. When you're in this situation, which is difficult, because I'm sure there's a part of you that says, I give up, and there's a part of you that says, I want to fight this to the end. There has to be a compromise. Like, what resources do you have? Where do you turn to, or where do you go from there to figure out what to do?
Well, that's a great question, because there's kind of a playbook out there, right? If you go to any of these, National Wildlife Federation, E. Benjamin Vogt, Doug Tallamy, there's the University of, I think it's Delaware, they tell you, here's what you should do. You put the signs, you have cues to care, you try to get on your board. And I'll tell you, and every time I would post, like, the Virginia Native Plant Society is really active and really awesome. And so I would post in there, and I would always get the same responses. And I went along and I checked off all of the boxes. It did everything on the list, and, didn't feel like I made any headway, still felt alone. There's really no one out there that's going to come and hold your hand, which is what led me to Wild Ones, which is another national nonprofit. They have a webinar out there that was done by a former city lawyer who enforced these ordinances, and on how to fight and how to make sure that you have all the resources at your disposal. And so that was really great. Unfortunately, again, I had done most of the things that were in the suggestion, but it did teach me how to kind of read the rules and see, what can they actually enforce, and to look at the state laws. What can they actually do? And because of that, I actually ended up starting my own chapter of Wild Ones, because when I reached out to all these other nonprofits and all these other organizations, they had words, but they didn't have any real support. And so what I wanted to do was be able to provide that hand holding for anybody else that wants to come to me and say, will you come speak at my HOA board? Will you come, help me edit my garden?
And that's the hard part. Like, any of us want to try to accomplish is to try to get someone to think about what they're doing. If they're doing something that might be not in the best interest, you want them to at least think about it or have the conversation. At this point, you can't even have the conversation. So you have you wonder what this case with the HOA, I wonder what your board thinks about, because that had to circulate. Someone had to say, look at this, someone sued, and what can we do to prevent this? Like, I would imagine that's a conversation being had off the record.
I'm going to try to say this without saying too much, but there were in the midst of all of this, there were other changes that were happening in my HOA. One of the things is there's different levels of governing documents in HOA, and some of them are stronger than others. And changes were being made to the governing documents while I was running for the board, while I was trying to do this, that I didn't speak out against because I was trying so hard to play nice and get on the board. And one of the changes is directly related to what I have been trying to do. And I think that it was a direct result of my work. And so, yes, I do think that this was going on. And I don't want to say behind my back, because they were doing it in front of everybody, right? They're out there. 70% of the people in the neighborhood had to sign off on it, right?
Yeah.
But some of these changes were things that I had gone and advocated for, and they are now codified in a much more solid manner that will make it much more difficult for us to change in the future.
We always kind of joke around in the office. Anytime there's a new rule, it's always a reaction, and you can almost put a name to the rule. Like, it's the new rule is now the Melinda rule, because it's being enforced because this happened. We've joked at a former place of employment that the employee handbook, you could go through and put names on each clause in the employee handbook. So it's.
I was in tears when I discovered I discovered that had happened, because I felt like I'd actually gone and make the situation worse rather than better.
And the hard part is you have a group of people that's speaking for everyone, and it's hard to say out of 1,400 people how many people side with you, or how many people feel that. How many other people is this happening to that you don't? 1,400 people is a lot of people to try to poll to find out if it's happening elsewhere. It'd be interesting to know if the majority of the people really don't care or really feel the way you feel.
I think the majority of people just want to live in a neighborhood where the dogs aren't barking and there's not trash on the street and, the classic cars up on blocks kind of a thing. We actually in kind of a funny situation because we have a neighborhood. A neighborhood was built 10 years before us, and we kind of engulfed them, and they are not part of our HOA, but they're surrounded by us. And their houses look fine. They're great. They have no HOA. I'd be happy to live there. So,
what is the state of your yard now with everywhere you're at? What do you have?
So this is, I still have that sunny pollinator garden out front, which is great. I have two giant trees in my front yard, and my neighbors have giant trees. And so the grass is slowly decaying. For the first 6 years I lived here, I tried so hard to grow grass under those trees. And so my plan is to replace it with some hardscaping and some Pennsylvania sedge, if I can get my hands on any at this point. And I've done a lot. I have drawn up a whole plan for landscaping beds, but I have to get those approved, especially if I'm going to try to be on the board and be on the ARB. And I don't know what's going to happen if I put those applications in now.
Here's the scary thing, because obviously it's so shaded you can't grow grass. But if you say, I want to put the sedge in because I can't grow grass, how do you know that they won't come back and say, we'll remove the trees?
They won't. They can't.
They can't.
Okay. So our neighborhood is very pro tree. I'm not 100%. It's interesting. So they could tell us to remove the trees, but it would be very difficult for them to put that one through because we have in our rules you can't cut down any trees that are over a 4-inch caliper without very good reason. So
all right. Awesome.
And these are giant.
Okay.
Giant trees.
All right, good. I would imagine if it's shading out the grass. Have you found allies on your journey that have helped? Like you mentioned some of these other organizations. Like, is there anyone that kind of grabbed you and said, I can help or I'm with you?
So yes, I reached out to a couple people and I have been working with someone on the Virginia Native Plant Society. So they've been working very hard on 2 bills that they just successfully got through the Virginia legislature that are in support of native plants on public grounds, right? So they're really supposed to prioritize using native plants. The other one is to start working on this invasive species problem. And they've been working on these bills for a long time, and they finally they're not what they wanted them to be. They're not like Delaware's invasive species list, but they're aiming in that direction. And so they, I think, are going to be really great allies. The woman who worked really hard on that has been connected up with me, and she's talked me through how they did that and what's going to happen. I have been working with what used to be the Audubon Naturalist Society and is now called Nature Forward, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation is really big here because bay health is really important, for you guys too, right?
Yeah.
And so those are some really good allies, and of course, Wild Ones. I started my own group here, and we've come up with kind of a little plan. But honestly, for the most part, I'm still really, really on my own. I think until we can get past a few hurdles. And one of those is that this is an election year in Virginia. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a sponsor for our bill. We have to have a senator or a delegate sponsor the bill. Who knows which of them are going to be here in November, the end of November. Mm-hmm. And so that's a hurdle. And the other one is, again, that they're still working on, they're kind of exhausted from working on these other 2 bills, which took them 2 years to get through. It took the Crouches, 2 years to get that bill through in Maryland. So it's a long process. I actually have a meeting with a senator tomorrow to talk it through. But again, he doesn't know if he's going to be in place for the next General Assembly in January of next year. So, yeah.
There's so many factors that are up in the air. Much kudos for the strength and will that you have to put forth the effort into this, because I'm sure many people would say I've had enough. But where do you go from here? What are your next steps? What is your plan to do this? Like, are your kids older now? Like, does it affect your kids? Does it affect your family?
I mean, it did. Absolutely. This whole thing absolutely affected my family. I mean, I was under a lot of stress. I wasn't sleeping. I felt like as part of this whole process, I felt like I was constantly being watched. I know people were driving by and taking pictures of my house. The board was asked to drive by and look at my house. I really feel like I don't belong here. Like I had concerns when we moved into this neighborhood, and everybody told me, no big deal. But now, I mean, I know I don't belong here. I don't care if you have a pink door. I don't care if you grow corn in your front yard. I want you to have solar panels. I want you to be able to park your RV here for a little while if you need to work. And so I know that this is not the right space for me. So I feel, that feels a little weird. I do have supportive neighbors. Some of them, I do have people that come and say, hey, can I have some plants? I've seen your posts. I want to put native plants in my backyard. Right. So, my next steps are try to get this bill through. And what I need to do is, while we're waiting to see who's going to be able to sponsor this bill, is I want to put a survey out there to, homeowners and say, hey, if you've ever lived in an HOA, have you run into a problem? I think what mostly we're going to hear is people who say, I've never tried it because I live in an HOA. I think before we started, you talked about some landscapers that won't work in HOAs, and I have run into that too. And people reaching out to landscapers saying, hey, I want to put a meadow in, a la Benjamin Vogt, and the guy saying, go back and talk to your HOA first, and then he never hears from them again. So stuff like that. Those are the things that we need to hear from, and those are the people that aren't going to think to reach out to me and say, hey, this is a problem, but that's exactly what's, it's been suggested to me to speak to the Soil and Conservation District about their stormwater mitigation issues. If they live in an HOA that says you can't do a rain garden, you can't do this, those things die in the water. And so I need to hear from those people. So I'm going to have a survey out for that. And I don't care if you live in Virginia, if you don't live in Virginia HOA, I really would love to just kind of, hear what's going on. And, because those are the stories that we'll need to take. And then once we can get a bill and get a sponsor, we have to circulate that around to the powers that be. Like, one of the reasons the invasive species bills don't get through are because of the landscapers, and they're because of the native plant, the traditional sellers who don't want to be told I can't sell barberry anymore, I can't sell English ivy anymore. They make a lot of money on those things, right? So what we have to do is find a way to get these people, that are able to lobby successfully, on board.
Knowledge is power. So I mean, we're definitely, the way we think, we're in the minority, but if you can slowly make some changes and get people to understand a few things, and hopefully that trickles through. But I know before we started recording today, I was talking to a coworker whose sister lives in an HOA, and I'm like, what attracted the HOA to her? And she's like, oh, her OCD, she loves it. Every mailbox is the same color, it's the same height, she can look down the road and everything's perfect and everything's the same. So I'm like, all right, so imagine if she was your neighbor. Like how that would be. And it's just varying ideas of what you want and trying to, I don't know that you can have a community full of like-minded people in this day and age.
No, but wouldn't it be amazing? I mean, and actually that's one of the things that I find incredibly frustrating is that, 1 minute I'm like, I'm really gung-ho, let's do this. Let's have all these beautiful plants in a front yard and make it look wild. And then the next minute, someone's telling me, don't go too crazy because make it look beautiful, make it look perfect, because there's no way we're going to win these other people over if we don't. Well, I'm not perfect. I'm doing it myself. I don't want to pay somebody to landscape it. I love doing this work myself. But I'm never going to, I mean, look at me. I have a nose ring. I have an eyebrow ring. There are millions of people out there that are going to write me off immediately because I don't fit their definition of a perfect person. And they're going to do the same with my lawn. Right. I don't want. So I find that incredibly frustrating because I don't know how to approach that.
Oh, it's funny. As soon as people find out I have tattoos, how quickly that conversation changes a little bit. Like that judgy comes in a little bit. But it's Tom and I do a talk where we talk about how to make native plants more palatable. To make it at least a conversation. It's like, all right, edge it out a little bit so it's not as wild, or put a sign up so people know what you're doing. And not even all of those options are available to you, which is difficult.
Right.
It's in taking that conversation away for you, and it should be a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I've never had lived in an HOA. I'm just getting used to living with neighbors, and but a lot of these things that we really or the HOAs really pine on, and they like hinge on this traditional aesthetic, don't really go that far back. Like we've talked about before, the concepts of lawns are within, for everyday people, are within really the last 100 years, probably even less.
I agree.
The book I'm going to cover in our next, we're lost in a loop again. The buzz you're going to hear, you will have heard Friday, but before this is like the concept of like house dogs. It's 50s, 1950. That's when you start seeing house pets. And like so many of these things that are just such a part of our culture that feel like they've been around forever, really have been around for like 70, 80 years. So you have only a few generations that have lived with this. It just happens that those tend to be the generations that are in power right now.
Yeah.
So
Right.
yeah, it's fascinating to me, just from like an how do you say anthropomorphic?
I'm not even going to try to say.
Anthropological? I don't know. It's something with people. Like the study of people. It's it's just fascinating how tied in we are to some of these things that really have not been around very, very long at all.
And it's all a compromise. You know, we're not where I live. I'm not in an HOA, but it is a big community, and we keep the front mowed, and we clean the leaves in the front yard. And our compromise is we don't do it in the back. You know, it's a different. It's a little more hidden. It backs up to a natural area. We make that compromise to kind of get along with our neighbors, but eventually that conversation is going to happen. It's going to move from the backyard to the front yard at some point. And the neighbors looking around across the street, they've been there for I don't know how many decades, and that's going to be the biggest shock to them when that conversation starts to happen.
Yeah.
But at least if I have a place in the backyard that I can take them to say, well, you don't see this, but this is what's happening back here. This is what we're working towards.
Right.
It's hard, and Tom's mentioned it with cutting things back in your front yard.
Oh yeah, no, I heard a secondhand comment the other day where one of our neighbors, one of the nursery neighbors, made a comment to someone else who works at the nursery saying, "Oh, how come Tom doesn't landscape his house?" And it's like, oh, it is landscaped. It's just not what they think of landscaping. But the person who made the comment is, I'm on the mower every Tuesday, and like making sure there's perfectly straight lines and Japanese barberry and just very sterile landscape. They aren't thinking past it being an ornament in their lawn, or in their yard.
That's where I really get stuck, is because I don't know how to have a conversation with people that aren't interested in having a conversation with me, right? If their only version of what it should be like is that mowed front yard with the stripes in it, right? And the little meatball bushes, they're never going to see, unless somebody that they know and love is able to, slip them Doug Tallamy's book, which is, I'm never going to make a dent there, but it doesn't, it's not stopping me from trying. And like I said, I swing from being, incredibly, vehement to trying to make nice and try to really, because it's so frustrating to feel like you're working so hard to do the right thing and everyone else is working against you.
Yeah.
There's a common ground somewhere. How hard it is to find that little pebble.
Yeah.
It's who knows what it will take. And you're right. Some people you're never going to change, and they're not going to change, and that's fine. It just, as you were saying that, it made me think. I'm like, I wonder how many people like have referred to you as a hippie. In based on your property, gone, look what's happening.
Yeah, I don't know. And the thing is that I would actually the person who complained about me accidentally outed themselves, and I figured out who it was, and I reached out to them and I said, hey, like, do you want to go to lunch? Like, let's talk. And I never got any response.
That's hard because nothing can change if the conversations don't happen.
Yep.
But if we're going to, when your survey is ready, we're going to put it in the show notes. So,
awesome.
and
Thanks.
we'll make an announcement on a buzz that we've updated it. So if this goes out before the survey's ready, we'll make sure we let everyone know when the survey's ready.
Okay.
But I
Great,
guess
thank you.
what we wanted to ask of you is for other people that are in similar situations, I guess this is a two-pronged question. What advice would you give to someone else doing this? And what would you do differently if you were starting over? How would you have handled what are some key things that you look back and say, if I'd done this, maybe things would be different? And what advice can you give to someone else moving forward?
So that is a really tough question for me because as I mentioned earlier, if I had all of my knowledge now and I could go back and do it again, I would do things different. And that's because of what I have learned about the people that I would be approaching. So, one of the things that I have learned is that if I had not called it a pollinator garden, I probably would have gotten a lot farther. I thought that was, everybody tells you that's the way to go. You appeal to the butterflies. Everybody wants butterflies, right? But turns out that the people in power, that was not the right way to sway them. But how was I supposed? There's no way for me to know that. So, if I could go back and do it differently, I would not have made the assumptions that I made. Right? That of course these people are going to be interested. I would have gone to that. Again, it was during COVID, so it was really hard. But I would have gone to that meeting and sat in. I would have educated myself ahead of time on the laws. The laws in Virginia say you can sit in through that whole meeting with very few exceptions. But the HOAs will politely invite you to leave. Right. So I would have stayed. And so I would have tried to have that conversation. But for anybody moving forward, that's something I would say. Number one, I would say educate yourself, read the rules, and before you go to change your garden, if you haven't done it yet, read the rules in your head. A lot of times there's a lot of place for wiggle room, especially in these older HOAs. They don't have their laws codified quite in a way that's, ironclad. And read the laws in your state about what can HOAs, enforce and not enforce, because a lot of times the HOAs don't know either. Like they were enforcing a rule here about solar panels that was not legal. And so Texas, Florida, Maryland, and another one I'm forgetting right now, they all have landscaping rules that say that you have to be allowed to xeriscape. You have to be allowed to do these, kind of what they called low impact landscaping in Maryland. And so educate yourself on that for sure. Find friends. Somebody who will listen to you. I have some really wonderful friends and family members who listen to me on the phone so that I could get it out to them and not go yell at the people in charge. And if you can find someone who's been through it and is willing to kind of walk you through it, if you can find a subject matter expert that will come and talk at your HOA, because that's the other mistake I made, was not reaching out and finding someone that would come and talk instead of me. That tree meeting that they asked me to go to, I shouldn't have done that. I should have had someone come with some version of authority that they would respect to talk to them and then separate, my situation. Like I said, Wild Ones has a webinar, which is really great information. Benjamin Vogt that you mentioned already has some great stuff. The Cues to Care, which I forget, there's a particular university that came up with that list of Cues to Care, showing what you've done. Educate yourself on your plant so that when they ask questions about why did you plant that one, you can say, oh, well, this is blah, blah, blah scientific name and this is why. And, that's helped me. I've planted a couple gardens up at my kids' school, and one of the vice principals knows a little bit about landscaping and plants, and he's like, oh, why did you plant that goldenrod there? That's going to be crazy. And I said, well, it's not Canada goldenrod, it's blue stem goldenrod. It'll be fine. And stuff like that, right? So, and then you know what? If you have to start from scratch, if you have to take it out, don't let that be. For me, I turned it into a positive by, reaching out to the Native Plant Society and saying, look, and I have all these plants to give away. Who can give them a good home? And I really got a lot of comfort from having people. They drove, to my house, picked up these plants, and I got to have a conversation with them in my front yard. And I would say, try to make friends where you can, if with the people in power. And it's hard to do because sometimes it feels like you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And it feels disingenuous. But the more people that you know and know you as a person and not just as that guy who's trying to plant stuff in their front yard, the better. And make sure you write stuff down. If you are having trouble in your HOA and you give up or you move forward, save that information so that, when it comes up in the future, you can use it to make progress. And if you're too tired, I think absolutely getting on the board is the number one best thing to do, 100%. If you don't have the time, if you don't have the energy, if you can't get on there, if you tried like me and you can't get on there, and you can't keep going, that's okay, right? Like I happen to be at a place in my life. My kids are older. I don't have a demanding job. I could do this right now. I know so many of my friends that could never have spent the time on this, and that's okay too, right? Like don't exhaust yourself. Don't ruin your life over this.
Not everyone's wired that way. Like I can't see me doing it. I just my anxiety is just ratcheting up listening to what you've gone through.
It was awful.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Well, that's I kind of wanted to end it a little bit on a positive note in a way. Like it's hitting home. So many things that advice that we've given. Now I'm second guessing myself based on some of the things that you're saying, and it's we always say. Nature doesn't have to be somewhere that you go. It can be right out your back door. You're supposed to, in the words of John McGee, don't forget to enjoy it. It's a place you have to enjoy it. So when you're doing it for all the right reasons to be a part of it, and then sometimes it's not even a place that you can go to enjoy it.
Right.
Where do you go? Where is your favorite place to escape a natural area to go and enjoy and reinvigorate you for the reason why you started doing it in the first place?
It's tough for me to talk about that without being a little bit negative too, because, as I said, we live near this park that's this beautiful riparian buffer, and we have Virginia bluebells here. And if you have never been to Virginia bluebells where they have spread out in their natural habitat, it is absolutely amazing. And trout lilies and the violets and the spring beauties. And so we have that here, and it is stunning. And that brings me incredible joy. And the great thing about spring ephemerals is that a lot of them will pop up even under all these horrible invasives, right? Because they're not competing at the same time. And so those are almost always there, even though one of my selling points for this is that our trails are being overtaken by the invasives. And so I have a little park that I took on, and we have spent 2.5 years working on pulling out with volunteers, hundreds of hours, and we're replacing it. And the bluebells are coming back, and it's really, really cool. And so that is going to be my happy place in a few years once I get that. And it's one of the things that's keeping me here, right? You asked about giving up, and I absolutely all the time I'm like, let's just leave. I can't stand it. I can't stand the thought that people hate me and hate what I'm doing. I can't stand the thought that people are looking at me, and it makes me angry that it's more important. Aesthetics are more important to you than being able to dry your clothes without a dryer and being able to have solar panels on your roof. But if I leave, if we had pulled up stakes and sold during this whole process, I would have had to rip everything out anyway because it's not approved, and they could have told me I had to, right? So at least this way, my stuff's still there. I'm trying to make a difference. I'm making a change, and so I think that those things will be my happy place. I can see a path forward. And so that's what I'm hoping.
I could say, in many ways, life is like school. You're stuck with the people that you're stuck with, regardless of if you get along with them or not. If they're best friends or if they're bullies, they are what they are. And it's just, it's such a weird, different approach that's how you would approach your neighbor to just turn them in, not have a conversation, things like that. And it's just, and not what I would expect, but I guess I'm not surprised either.
There's a lot that goes into it, right? Because some people would probably respond very negatively. Like I've had a lot of conversations with people about that. Like some people get mad if you leave a note on their door saying, "Hey, can you please clean up your blah, blah, blah." Some people are like, "Why didn't they knock on my door and talk to me in person?" Some people were like, "I can't believe they bothered me by my knocking on my door." Like there's no way to win it all. And I absolutely would welcome conversation. Sometimes I do a better job than others. But they don't know that. I could be an angry person with a baseball bat, right? So I can't blame them too much, but we are neighbors, and I want to be your neighbor. Like, let's talk about it. So, but.
Yeah. And then just following off on that, I always laughed when at people who would call the police over like trivial little things. Like I parked at my in-laws' house, and the back of my truck was just in front of the neighbor's property, and there was a sign there saying like no parking between there and the curb, and I was like a foot past it, and he called the police instead of just coming over and knocking. He had their number to say, hey, just so you know, this is even though it wasn't necessarily that big of a deal anyway, but he called the police instead of there's a business logic that we kind of follow at our nursery, and then I've learned from a couple other places. And it's just for everyday relationships, but you shouldn't triangulate. If you have an issue with somebody and how they're doing something, you shouldn't be going and telling someone else about it and complaining to them, because all you're doing is harboring ill feelings about that person with someone else. They're either going to not like you because you complain a lot, or they're going to not like the other person about what they're saying.
That's a good point.
You need to approach that person and address that you don't understand why they're doing something, but then listen to why they are doing what they're doing. So if you're one of the people who doesn't like native plants and you see someone planting native plants, you need to ask them why they're doing what they're doing. It'll list out why it upsets you, and then listen to why they're doing it that way, because you might not understand their perspective. You're just looking at it from your own selfish perspective, like we all do. We all look at stuff selfishly. Yeah. So, no, it's just something I've thought of when you were saying that. Yeah. Oh, yeah, people don't like when you knock, or people like when you just leave a note. Why wouldn't you knock? Yeah, it's interesting.
It's hard.
Yeah. It's one of the things I've learned specifically from this job is being a wholesale nursery, you're dealing with the same customers all the time. And you may not like your customers, and they may not like you, but you're doing business. And, sometimes there's things that happen where it's not going well, and it hasn't gone well for a while, and then something happens and it changes. Like, some of my favorite customers we didn't get along 15 years ago for a couple years. And then sometimes it was just we had lunch together and we found common ground with family, or I was able to help them with something, or they were able to help me with something. And it just, I don't know, it just triggers something that you're like, oh, I need to look at this differently. And it just changed moving forward. But, I didn't have a choice regardless. We both made the choice to make the best of it. Right. And I have really good friends because of that throughout the industry, because we kind of were forced to work it out. It's kind of like a parent when you have the two kids. It's like the two of you have to work it out, and that's what happened. And I didn't know that would happen. I'm happy that it happened. It's sometimes it doesn't happen. Well, and I think that's, like you said, that's something that's not going to happen if you go and call your boss, or you go and call their boss, or whatever, right? And you get the HOA involved. It's like calling but once you've called the police, it's a problem now. Once you call the HOA, it's a problem. And you know what? Those people might not have intended for me to get my entire front. In fact, I bet they didn't want my entire front yard to get ripped out. I bet they just wanted me to take better care of it. Right. But once they called the authorities, the HOA, now they have no choice but to get involved and to make me do something about it. Meanwhile, if they had come and talked to me directly, we all might have been able to get, to it. So, it reminds me of these things people are talking about, with the police, like, about you don't call them until you don't have a last resort. Because once they're involved, you've lost control. Yeah. Well, like you said, even once you got the letter from the lawyer, that conversation's over. It's. Yep. And it's unfortunate that it gets to that point, but once it gets to that point, you have to deal with it.
There was a politician on I shouldn't call him a politician. He's a farmer that's on our State Board of Ag, which is a political agency, but talking about a bill, and he's like, we shouldn't just hate the bill because of the bill. We don't like one little part of it. We could agree on the other 99%. There's one little thing, and that's holding up everything. So let's talk about that and address why we don't like it and why they want it, and address the little things. So kind of what you were saying is you had the one person, it was probably a little thing, and they made it a big issue where all of a sudden the whole thing gets squished instead of Just I just don't like that one thing that's a little bit taller.
Yeah, and the thing for me again is that like ultimately I did get to keep part of it, but that was only because I persevered, right? Like it took me 9 months to get them to let me have any of it, right? And that's not, I would not expect that as a normal outcome, a normal thing, right? So. Yeah.
All right. Should we do favorite native plant? I was just looking at time. I was just looking at time. I was like, all right. The funny thing is, I feel like we could talk about this probably for another hour. You did say you were free for another 3 hours. So
I did.
So our last question is always the same question. It's a simple question, but at the same time, very difficult. What is your favorite native plant?
So I recently found out that some of the things that I would have called my favorite native plant are actually not native to my county. And I wouldn't say that I'm a purist, but if I'm going to pick my favorite native plant, it's going to be, a celandine poppy was one that I really loved. And it's, here in Virginia, we've got a lot of different, coastal Piedmont, all that stuff. Right. So, and then I really love
that would have been a great choice. That would have been a great choice.
I really, really love them. But, and I do have some, but, and then wild blue phlox is really awesome right now, in my area. And golden ragwort is one that is our champion here in Virginia because of the stilt grass and all that. I mean, just everybody, what can I do to replace my English ivy? You see golden ragwort every time, right? And in the summer, I really love New York ironweed because I can't grow it here. I only have that tiny little strip and I love the purple and I can't grow it. But my absolute favorite that I'm going to pick is just the common blue violet, the Viola sororia. It pops up everywhere. If you leave your lawn, it'll be all over your lawn. It has beaten back liriope for me, snow on the mountain, agapodium, chameleon plant, and it just is just doing its thing, like just taking over my whole backyard, and I really, really love it. So that's going to be it for me.
Has anyone picked that?
I don't remember.
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
I don't think so, but that's a fantastic choice. Fantastic choice. All right. So we always end the show. We each take a turn with a final thought. So this is where we hand it over to you. We give you the floor. You can use the time however you'd like to. You want to filibuster? You can talk it out for 3 hours. But no, we hand it over to you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say that this is such a personal topic. It was so emotional. It is so difficult. And all along for me, I feel like we're wasting time, right? Like we don't have time. I don't have time to get this bill through. We don't have time. We've got to make these changes now. And that really fed into my sense of urgency and not being able to plan for the long run. And it is really important. But not alienating people is really important. And I think that's, one of the mistakes that I made and that I'm going to have to deal with going forward. And again, if you can't fight this fight right now, that's okay. But tell me so that I can use your information going forward. Please, let someone know that you're having this problem. Reach out to even just email your state legislator and say, hey, listen, I really want to do this and I can't, and this is why. And I keep planting native plants, I guess.
Awesome. That is a wonderful thought. And I want to thank you for sharing and having this personal conversation with us, because I know it's a lot for anyone to share. And we definitely want you to give us updates as you move forward and as you feel comfortable with it, so we can share with the audience. Like we mentioned, I think it was off air, that we would love to do a rooted discussions on this and have a few different sides that we can have a good conversation about it from other people that are involved in other situations. But would you like to go, Tom?
Yeah. And just as we were talking, I was thought of two quotes that I've heard throughout my life, and I don't remember who said the first one, but I remember who said the second one.
All right.
The first one is that politics is a popularity contest for ugly people. And then the second one, my dad said about just like township politics and all that, and he's like, there's not a lot of people who go into that just because they like out of the pure goodness of their heart. There's a lot of people who there's some financial motivation to get into it, or they just like to feel powerful. And that's, as you're telling your story, Melinda, that's one of the things that kind of stuck out to me, is that you have people who this is a way they can kind of get a little bit of power in their life. And maybe they don't have that at home, or they don't have that in their job or other aspects, and it just makes them feel a little bit more important. And to be honest, they're probably trying to do something good at the same time, but
or at least started out that way.
It's at least started out that way. And then it's just, as it becomes, there's that whole Stanford, why are we talking about this? There's that whole Stanford prison experiment, and you had the guards they're all college kids. You had the guards but just that little bit of power, all of a sudden the guards started getting too powerful, and the prisoners were too subservient. So it's just important when you're in these kind of conflicts that you have to understand what you're going up against and that kind of stuff. And but even though, Melinda, your journey hasn't necessarily ended in triumph, and not to say that it's over, it still has a positive outcome, and sharing your story, I think, is going to inspire a lot of people who are traveling down this same road. So no, it was good to hear, even though it's not necessarily the outcome that we've wanted yet. It's just an inspirational story.
I do have a question, as Tom was thinking. Is there a length of time you can serve on the board?
No,
no,
not in my HOA.
And that's I was thinking that has to be difficult, being put in a situation where sometimes you're always dealing with problems, and it may not be a problem to you, but it's a problem to other people. You're constantly dealing with problems, and you're mediating, and over time that wears. Mm-hmm. And you can easily look at it negatively, or it's hard to come to the table and say, let's talk about a solution. Sometimes you're like, oh, I'm dealing with this again. All right, no. And I have a feeling that has to happen. If you're on the board for 20 years, you've probably seen and heard just about everything, and you've had to deal with it, and you're just like, not again. I don't want to do this. And I'm sure that's, like, to me, I'm just getting anxious. I can feel like my shoulders tightening. It's just, because it's no fun always having to mediate that.
That's what I hear.
Yeah. So it's, what I appreciate is, it's amazing. I guess my final thought is that it's so, I don't know what word I want to use. It's hard hearing how political just nature can be. That it can't just be. It just can't be. It's political. Everyone has a different thought or ideology of what it consists of, and there has to be some kind of common ground. And the only way we get there is by doing what we did today and having a conversation. And I'm hoping this conversation is heard, and it sparks more conversation, and it gets the wheel rolling in a positive way. That we do get the outcome that we'd like. And I have a good feeling. It will. So thank you. I really appreciate that. I think those were all really good, valid final thoughts. Not that they're not. They always are.
Thank you.
Except for me sometimes. All right, Tom, why don't we close it out?
All right, so that's going to wrap us up for today. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed listening to Melinda. And Melinda, how do you pronounce your last name? I should have asked. Soltis. That's exactly how I would have said it.
That's how I would have said it.
Clarification.
You should have just went for it.
I didn't want to embarrass myself. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Native Plants, Healthy Planet, presented by Pinelands Nursery. And a little just follow-up on that is we're going to have that survey and some other stuff in the show notes after this comes out. So if you want to participate, just go in the show notes in your in the app. We'll have it on our website, nativeplantshealthyplanet.com, and then also they show up in the Facebook.
They show up everywhere.
They're all over.
I want to say thank you to the Egocentric Plastic Men for contributing our theme music. Make sure you stream or buy their music wherever you consume music. You can follow us on Twitter at Pineland Nursery, Facebook at Pinelands Nursery NJ, Instagram at Native Plants _Healthy Planet, or at Pinelands Nursery, and also at YouTube. You can view us at Pinelands Nursery. Don't forget about the question and comment line, 215-346-6189. I will repeat that, 215-346-6189. You can ask a question or leave a comment. We'll do the best we can to air it on a future episode of The Buzz and answer your question. And let's not forget, the Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group went through a whole, I felt like I was approving members all weekend. So it's crazy, and the conversations are always great over there, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, so you can buy Native Plants Healthy Planet merch at our website, www.nativeplantshealthyplanet.com. There's a link right at the top that takes you to our Teespring store. There's T-shirts, phone cases, aprons. I forget all the stuff I put up there. I did have another design I teased a while back that I haven't posted yet, but I will be doing that soon. And again, we don't keep any of the profits. We have plans to go visit Santino.
We keep saying
at Bowman's
that.
Hill.
We had a date, and he had jury duty.
and I have jury duty as well, I think, next week.
Yeah.
So we'll be dropping off his check soon. But yeah, we don't keep any of the profits for that. We give it to organizations that we feel are doing really good boots on the ground work with native plants. You can listen to Native Plants Healthy Planet. In fact, you already are, but you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, really wherever you consume your podcasts. When you're there, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review, hit subscribe if you haven't already. Those two things go a really, really long way into promoting the message of native plants on the Apple Podcast charts. And if you do a little write-up with that review, I give you a shout-out on our Buzz episodes. So with that, thank you, everyone. I'm Tom.
And I am Fran. Thank you again, everyone. Melinda, thank you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next week, we have a Buzz coming up, so make sure you tune in. And until then, keep it native.
Thank you for listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Remember to like, share, follow, and comment.